In 1992, the United States went to the Barcelona Olympics with the greatest basketball team ever assembled. The Dream Team was everything it was hyped up to be. In the first games where NBA players were allowed to compete, the United States sent 11 future Hall of Famers to Spain, and Christian Laettner for some reason. Just a few weeks after the 1992 NBA Finals, for a glorious stretch of about 8 days, NBA legends like Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Karl Malone, Charles Barkley got to put their team rivalries aside to compete for their country together. Never had there been a more impressive collection of talent than there was in that team in 1992, and to absolutely no one's surprise, the US dominated the competition, winning all of their games by an average of nearly 44 points. That gold medal was the high point in the history of American basketball, and arguably of what a basketball team could be in general. And then, 12 years later, the US team went to Athens 2004 and completely embarrassed themselves. The 2004 version of the NBA was a very different league to what it was in 1992. The Dream Team generation of Jordan, Barkley, and Ewing had somehow managed to all peak at around the same time, to the point that nearly that entire team, barring our friend Christian Laettner and Larry Bird and his bad back, went to Barcelona between the ages of 26 and 32. 12 years later, the NBA was a league in transition, with distinct tiers between players like Shaq, Kobe, and Kevin Garnett leading the league in their prime, guys like LeBron James and Carmelo Anthony just starting out. There was also a bit of a power vacuum among the league's teams at that point, with the Lakers right in the middle of literally falling apart, and the Spurs still working Ginobili and Tony Parker into the main rotation. The league's champions in 2004 were the Ben Wallace, Rip Hamilton Detroit Pistons, a very good team, but certainly not at the caliber of the 92 Bulls. The US still had an embarrassment of riches compared to most other countries that they'd be up against at the 2004 Olympics, but the gap in talent wouldn't be as big as it had been in the past. It was about to get a lot smaller. For a myriad of reasons, the US wasn't going to be able to just stack its roster with all the best players from the NBA. Guys like Mike Bibby and Tracy McGrady, who was the league's top scorer at that point, were pretty wary of security concerns in Greece and elected to remove themselves from consideration. Vince Carter and Kevin Garnett, both All-Stars and Garnett the league's MVP, were both getting married around that time, so they were out. Shaq, Jermaine O'Neal, and Ben Wallace had all just had really long runs in the playoffs, so they weren't going. And neither was Kobe Bryant, who was dealing with some legal stuff. All of that meant that the US talent pool, usually the deepest in the world by a pretty considerable margin, was going to be a lot smaller than Larry Brown and his coaching staff probably would have wanted, or even expected. And the team they took to Greece ended up being a bit of a hodgepodge because of it. When the roster was confirmed in early July, Allen Iverson and Tim Duncan were the oldest players on it, at 29 and 28 respectively. This was a far cry from the fully formed superstars who went to Barcelona in 92, or even the team that won the gold in 2000 in Sydney. In addition to being the oldest players on a team that had an average age under 24, Iverson and Duncan were also pretty clearly the best players on the team, which isn't a bad thing in and of itself. But after that, it was guys like Stephon Marbury and Sean Marion carrying big chunks of the load. And again, those guys were really good players, but in a situation like the Olympics, where you're essentially an all-star team that gets thrown together and plays all of its games in about a month, it's not ideal. It's probably still workable because, again, it's the United States, and it's basketball, and we have the best league in the world, but there were also a lot of questions about how Larry Brown, a notoriously persnickety coach who was insistent on his players playing the right way, was running the U.S. team. Between the shaky leadership dynamic and an even shakier roster, maybe it shouldn't have been as much of a surprise when the team underperformed once they got to Greece. And yet, it still totally was. Before the 2004 games in Athens, the U.S. men's national team had lost one game in 20 years of Olympic competition, including going undefeated in 3 straight Olympics from 1992 to 2000. 2004 alone, the team lost 3 games, 2 in group play, including an embarrassing 19-point loss to Puerto Rico in their first game of the competition. And look, I'm not trying to disrespect anybody by saying this. All of these teams are obviously super good because they're in the Olympics and they're the best teams in the world, but the United States should not have been losing these games. A roster full of NBA players, a few of whom already were or would become some of the greatest ever, should be able to handle a team that might have 1 or 2 guys in the league. Argentina won the gold medal and were pretty comfortably the US's biggest competition, but outside of Manu Ginobili, their NBA-level talent was like Luis Scola and Fabricio Oberto. It's not like we're talking about the Showtime Lakers here. What went wrong in 2004? Well, a lot of things, but the most obvious one was that for a while, the strategy was just kind of throw a bunch of guys together, hire a big-name coach to pull it all together, and then turn them loose. Win a gold medal, rinse and repeat, and for a while, that worked. But the standards at USA Basketball have been dropping since the 2000 Olympics and into the 2002 World Championships. Not because the US didn't have the best players anymore, but because they didn't have the best system. After 2004, that wasn't going to be a problem again. In April of the next year, USA Basketball hired Jerry Colangelo to be the first managing director of the national team, consolidating the team leadership structure to try and make the whole thing more cohesive. And it worked. Colangelo had full control over which players played for the national team, and for how long. There wouldn't be any more late cancellations or confusion over who was going and who wasn't. Players would make a 3-year commitment that included both the 2006 World Championships and the 2008 Olympics in Beijing. There would be a new coach, too. Larry Brown was out, pretty understandably, and would be replaced by Mike Krzyzewski, an equally tough, but maybe not equally crotchety coach, who had been an assistant for the Dream Team. So with the house now officially cleaned and the new leaders in place, it was time to choose who would go to Beijing 2008. This wouldn't be the Dream Team, but instead, the Redeem Team, the group of players who would restore the nation's honor and hopefully their dominance on the Olympic stage. LeBron, Dwayne Wade, and Carmelo Anthony all wanted to be a part of the team, especially after Larry Brown barely played any of them at the Olympics in Athens. Kobe Bryant was in for his first Olympics too, as were newcomers like Chris Bosh, Chris Paul, and Dwight Howard, and 35-year-old Jason Kidd, just to make sure that the average age wasn't quite so low this time around. There was a better mix of talent on this team, and there was arguably just more talent in general too. The 2004 team had just 2 guys who'd made the All-Star team the year before, Iverson and Duncan, but the 2008 team had 9. This was all part of a multi-layered effort to get the program back to being as dominant as it had been in the past, and they were well on their way to doing that. But that doesn't mean it was easy. The 2006 World Championships were the first real road test for USA Basketball 2.0, and it went poorly. The US flew through the group stage with 5 straight wins by an average of over 20 points, but rather frustratingly, lost in the semifinal to Greece. It wasn't the Olympics, so it wasn't the end of the world or anything, but also probably not the way you want to show everyone all the progress you've made. Strictly speaking, they hadn't made any progress at all. 2 years after those disastrous Olympics, they were right back in the 3rd place game, and against Argentina of all teams. Sometimes the universe really does have a sick sense of humor, but thankfully, they had a while until the Olympics to figure everything out. Figure it out, they did. After a few exhibition games, it was off to the big show, the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, where Coach K and his team would start their road to redemption against the host country, China. The US flew through group play, with their closest game, weirdly, coming against Angola, but even that was a 21-point win. They beat everybody in their group with relative ease, and one thing that jumps out immediately from looking at the stats is how deep this team was. Larry Brown's 8-man rotation was gone, replaced by a team where nearly every player averaged double figures for minutes across the tournament. The 2008 version of the team wasn't as top-heavy either, with 5 different players averaging well over 10 points per game, and the assist numbers just going way, way up. Like, Chris Paul was far from being the top scorer, that would be Dwayne Wade, but if you ask me, having a couple of actual point guards was probably the biggest difference between these two teams. From there, it was on to the knockout rounds. It started with a pretty good Australia team in the quarterfinals, which featured NBA cult heroes Andrew Bogut and Joe Ingles, but the Americans still overwhelmed them. Kobe had 25, and 5 different Americans scored in double figures, and they skated into the semifinals by a final score of 116-85. But the next round was the semifinals, against guess who? Manu Ginobili and Argentina. Again, the universe was just having a laugh, but also setting the Americans up for a pretty sweet redemption arc. This was the same team that upset the US in the same round 4 years ago. Although Manu Ginobili got hurt and barely played this time around, but we're not going to let that take away from a good story, now are we? Despite Luis Scola scoring 28 points, the Argentinian team couldn't completely make up for Ginobili only getting 6 minutes, and behind a virtuoso free throw shooting performance from Carmelo Anthony, the US team exercised their demons against the same team that had knocked them out 4 years before. The only obstacle left was Spain, which was not going to be an easy one to get past, mostly because they had 2 7-foot-tall obstacles named Gasol on their team. There were some other current and future NBA players on that Spain team too, with Rudy Fernandez, Jose Calderon, and a 17-year-old Ricky Rubio all lining up to try and win Spain's first gold medal in basketball. That Spanish team was good, and they would give the Americans everything they wanted and more. The US led 69-61 at halftime, but halfway through the third, the lead was down to 4, and Spain were starting to feel like the gold medal was within their reach. With 8 minutes left to go in the fourth, the lead was cut to 2, And after all that kerfuffle about not winning gold in 2004, the US were perilously close to having the same thing happen again. But the US had something this time around that they didn't have in 2004, and his name was Kobe Bryant. With the US holding onto a slim lead down the stretch, Kobe hit a couple of shots that only he would take to keep the Spanish at bay, and they needed every bit of it before the game was over. Spain simply would not go down without a fight, and gave the US a test worthy of the Olympic setting. But where the 2004 team's lack of leadership let them down, the 2008 team's resolve ended up winning them the gold medal. The Redeem team had done just that, but there's a lot to unpack from the journey that got them there. I think you can tell pretty much the entire story of USA men's basketball through the lens of those three Olympics: the utter dominance of 1992, the embarrassment in 2004, and then the return to greatness in 2008. It's a classic redemption arc. A great institution falls in love with its own legend and backslides its way into losing its greatness, and then has to rediscover itself to get it back. There are even some recurring characters, like the Argentinians popping up in both semifinals in 2004 and 2008. I don't want to call them the villains, because I don't think that's super fair, but they were the perfect adversary for the US on their road to redeem themselves. Then there's the Spanish, who served as the hosts for the Dream Team in 1992, and then the final boss for the gold medal in 2008. The US has gone on to reclaim their status as the dominant force in international basketball since those games in Beijing, but I would argue that there can and will never be a better era of USA men's basketball than this one. And I'm very much including the performance in 2004 in that, because it taught us an extremely important lesson. American exceptionalism does not apply to basketball. No matter how much of an advantage you think you might have talent-wise, in any sport, no one is immune to poor planning. If you don't have a cohesive strategy in place, and all the other teams around you do, your advantage is going to be significantly reduced, if not wiped out altogether. That performance showed that USA basketball had lost its way, and that meant it was vulnerable, but it also made them realize that they needed to find it again. The Redeem team from 2008 got the Americans back on the right path, but they would have never known they needed to change paths in the first place had 2004 not happened. All three of these Olympic Games are integral to the story of US men's basketball, past, present, and future. From Jordan to LeBron, from Barcelona to Beijing, that future looks a lot brighter because of the lessons the program learned from this incredibly important 16-year period. Hi everybody, thanks so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like it. This is one of my favorite stories in recent sports history, and there's so much I had to leave out for the sake of time. So if there's something you remember about the Redeem team, where you watched them, how it made you feel, whatever, leave a comment below so we can all reminisce a little. And that doesn't just apply to Americans either. If you're from Argentina, or Spain, or Australia, or any of the other countries I mentioned, we'd love to hear your thoughts too. Like the Olympics, this community is multinational and multicultural, but wherever you're tuning in from today, that's all we've got for this week. Hope to see you back here soon. Bye.